things that I get asked working in innovation is technology good or bad? That's a regular question. I understand it. I always find it to be a little bit of a funny question because I never know how to answer it. And I can see why people ask it, though, because you see these headlines, things like AI is this new superpower that we have, or Web3 is going to transform the web, which has already transformed our lives. Blockchain has all this potential for us. But sometimes even in the exact same publications, you read, well, actually AI is probably the end of humanity, all of crypto is a scam, the metaverse is this dystopian place. And so you hear conflicting messages about this stuff, and honestly, who's to know what to believe? But ultimately, it actually impacts all of us. And actually, I was pretty impressed to see that it especially impacts people in Romania, because this is an interesting development when you do what I do for a living, that the first AI advisor to an administration, that your prime minister has built this tool called Ion. Has anyone engaged with this thing yet? Anyone? So it's more press than actual usage? Okay, that sounds right. A lot of AI work is. That said, in theory, this scrapes public sentiment and anything that you guys are sharing in public environments, and then is a voice of the people to, in theory, help the administration understand how people are reacting, how they feel about certain subjects. That's pretty interesting, because now AI is literally supposed to represent your population to your prime minister. So it does impact us. But ultimately, the question about it being good or bad, I'm going to reframe slightly. Technology is a tool. And like all tools, it can be good or it can be bad. I was laughing with Whitney about this because I was like, you know what's a good example of that? When you want to cut down a tree, an axe is a very good tool. If you kill someone with that axe, it's now a bad tool. It's very hard to make an opinion about the axe. It depends on how you're using it, quite obviously. And so I wanted to show you the technical definition of what a tool is, or technology is, which is the practical application of knowledge. And I thought this was important to think about, because we spend a lot of time thinking about the application, but deciding what we're using it for and what our priorities are that we even want tools for, I think is arguably the more important question. And so I'm going to break this up into just talk a little bit about our relationship with tech. So the first thing is we have to figure out what drives us, right? Like, what is it as humans, as humanity, that we care about? Because that's the first step in figuring out what we even want to do. The second step is what tools we make. This one matters a lot. Amazingly, these two questions get skipped when people are talking about technology. Instead, most of the conversation is focused on this last piece, which is how we use our tools. It's how you end up with the question like, is it good or is it bad? Well, the question is, did we choose the right tools? Were we motivated by the right things? And then once we started using those tools, how did that change how we're motivated? I think this is a much better way to think about our relationship with tech. And there's something interesting about this relationship, and I think this is why the media tends to cover it wrong. It's the speed at which this stuff happens. Actually, what drives us as humanity is pretty slow. But the tools we make, that happens a little bit faster. And then the way we apply those tools, that happens very fast. And that's the part that feels like, wow, the things are really moving. I'm not sure if things are good or bad. It's ambiguous what's happening. But ultimately, those first two steps impact the third step. And I want to just talk a little bit about why I think the question is a little bit different. Instead of asking how technology impacts us, I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking to you about how we impact technology, because I think this is the more important question. So I'm obviously an innovation nerd. I've done a lot of work in the space. I'm a student of it. I'm also a teacher of it. And so, of course, I decided I'd use some of my free time to understand all of the greatest technology leaps that we've had since modern civilization was born, arguably pre-modern civilization. And something is pretty obvious, which is there's more leaps. It is moving faster. That thing you feel, it's true. But what's interesting in this experiment is I wanted to figure out what was driving these innovations when you go back and look at them. And the list of these almost doesn't matter. Most people could agree. There's certain obvious things everyone points at as those are innovations that we can all agree on. I'm just going to choose 14 random ones across time because I want to talk about them as a group. And you see it starts from everything from gunpowder to optical lenses to antibiotics to a washing machine to the iPhone. Whatever you have is probably going to be somewhere included in this list. I'm going to use these 14 as an example. And the thing I started to notice is when I was trying to figure out what drives us is they kind of start to cluster into eras. Now, these aren't like the way historians talk about eras, where it's like, in 1831, this ended and this began. That's not it. But if you look at what the innovations actually do for us, the earliest ones are really about our survival. It's literally, how do we live? How do we live longer? How do we live when we confront our enemies? Those are the main innovations in the earlier periods of time, right? Then you move into this interesting era, which really was about expansion. This is a lot more about how do we get the most out of our land, our water, our air. Now we're still doing expansion with space. This is still a driver, but it's less the focus than recently. And you can tell this one feels different. The innovation era we're in now is convenience. It's almost insane to think convenience is what came after expansion, which came after survival. But that is actually how these things cluster together over 3 eras. And when you look at the 3 of them, you can learn a lot. And I'm actually going to look backwards for a second so that we can figure out what we can expect looking forward about that relationship with technology. So the first observation is just figuring out what drives us. As I said, you saw the kind of drivers: survival, expansion, convenience. But what's interesting about those is you'll notice they're higher order each time. And if you just use, and look, there's so many marketers in this room, I'm sure you all have way overseen Maslow's hierarchy, right? This is an overused framework, but it is super relevant when you talk about humanity as a whole. And basically what Maslow argues is the first thing that any human and any society needs to worry about is your physiological needs: air, water, things like that, right? And then above that, your safety needs. That makes sense too. You've covered the basics now. You want to protect yourself. Above that, love and belonging. These are your connections, your intimacy. Above that is esteem. That's your self-respect, your reputation. And then, hopefully, for some of us, probably Teresa, who is a rock star, you get to self-actualization, which is the ability to be the best version of yourself. And so if you look through it, you can see how the eras hit that, right? Vaccination, one of the greatest innovations of all time. We literally ended smallpox, the thing that was killing 1 in 3 people that it infected, through the use of this. That took about 400 years of work, and we figured out a lot of people fiddling around with it, and eventually someone named Jenner gets credit for it. Of course, the person who finishes the finish line always gets the credit, but there's many generations of work before it. But you can see we're moving up Maslow's hierarchy. If I took the steam engine as an example of expansion, this drove the Industrial Revolution. You could see how you have to feel pretty safe before you start traveling around, before you decide that you want to be connected to more people. That's a higher order need. And then you get to, by the way, that was about 100 years of work to get to the steam engine, right? Again, one person will get credit for it, but ultimately there's about 100 years of development. And then I use the iPhone as an example of a mobile phone because, like you, the first time I saw one, it just blew my mind. It was magic for all of us. And the iPhone is interesting because it's clearly just for convenience. We've all agreed we're going to carry around a computer in our pocket that has a shitty battery life and that, you know, frustrates us at times, and if your mind cracks, in fact, I'm pretty sure I lost it over there just moments ago. That's only about convenience. That's about 40 years of work. Doesn't mean Apple worked on it for 40 years. Certainly companies like Motorola played a role. Moving on to the next step of this, it's, okay, so we're moving up the hierarchy, but what can we learn about what tools we decide to create? And this is the thing I think is wildly misunderstood about innovation. I think everyone feels like, I mean, I'm a chief innovation officer. I do innovation work for companies. Core technology leaps, the types of things that make it as a black dot on that line I showed you, those really big leaps, those are very resource intensive. It is almost impossible for one person, even though we like crediting one person with work, generally a white man, and we say, look, you did it. But the reality is, it takes incredible resource to do one of these innovations. And I'm going to use just today's example, which is space. Space is a thing that many, obviously, is on many people's minds at the moment. The only reason that we were able to, and I'm putting the space shuttle as the innovation here, that comes out of basically 2 governments trying to beat each other to the moon. Many other governments would have loved to participate, but they didn't have the resources to do it. So the Soviet Union and the United States are in a war to get to the moon, and lo and behold, they spend what in today's dollars is hundreds of billions of dollars each to go and do this thing. Now that the core technology exists, a few more people can start to participate. But where we are in space, it's still early. Those few more people, they're pretty rich. All of them have been Teresa's boss, I think, if I heard the intro right. That is an interesting group because this is a group of people that we can say, oh, space travel is being privatized. That's technically true. But it's being privatized by people that have such extreme resources that they can actually play in a game that tends to be limited previously to governments. For perspective, obviously that's Branson, Bezos, and Musk. Musk has a net worth of 250 billion US dollars. I'm sorry, I'm going to say all my numbers in US dollars, forgive me. I believe the GDP of Romania is 280 billion US dollars. That means basically, no. Yeah, and he's going to give it away maybe. He might. But the point is, yes, it looks like this is privatized, but it's the equivalent of someone as rich as a country doing it. So the access is very small on these core technologies. But we're kind of ending up with reusable rockets. That's a major innovation we can all start to use, but someone else has to focus their resources. This is exactly where we are with AI. And this is one of the things I mean about misinterpreting how big innovations happen. AI is going to have about 110 billion US dollars spent on it just this year. So you all probably work at companies spending money in AI, know of people that are contributing to AI, and you go, wow, it's happening everywhere. We're all innovating together. Except, let me map these dollars out for you. Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft are the majority of that. The majority is coming out of just 4 companies. That means that everything I'm doing, you're doing, everybody else, unless you work at one of these 4 companies, you're in the little gray area. We're all other on this chart. So it can feel like we're all participating in something, but again, the amount of time and the amount of energy you need and the amount of money that you bring to the table, that's a critical factor, is ultimately limits who gets to decide what tools we make. And we have to figure that out before we talk about the implication of the tools. There is an interesting point, though, because I said time, I said money, and I said the amount of energy you spend, but there's actually a 4th resource. And this is actually why governments historically have been very good at innovation, but even they lose to these players, which is data. It is no coincidence that the world's richest companies, cash-rich companies, are also the world's most data-rich companies. That's the resource that lets them build the huge advancements currently happening in AI. Again, we can play, but we didn't decide what the tools were. We get to play with the tools that they've made us. That's a core decision before we have a conversation about whether or not technology is, quote, good or bad. And that's an incredible resource that gets overlooked when you decide who's playing with what. And I'll bring that to our last kind of part of this cycle of how we use our tools, because this is really what gets a lot of focus, right? And here's where actually innovation gets exciting, and probably where, if you do innovation work, you probably work on this last leg of the cycle, which is the more people that can access those core technologies, again, that a very limited group chose, the more value the original innovation gets. You can see the incentive in it, but you can also see the interesting opportunity there. We actually have a chance to influence how things get used. And I'll use a simple example. The telegraph, which was something multiple European governments and the US governments basically invested in and brought to fruition. The telegraph was obviously, prior to the telegraph, communication was parcel and pigeon. Now, we suddenly have the ability to communicate very quickly. This changed foreign relations, it changed global politics, because governments spent money to lay a wire across the Atlantic. None of us can sign up and just go and do that ourselves. It takes that level of resource to do it. And it was mostly to communicate with diplomats, ambassadors, armies. Suddenly, you don't have to send someone out and hope they represent you well, but your central government, your capital, can start to actually have those conversations because they can tell you what to say and how to behave. That's a pretty good investment for a government. But the next user of the telegraph, which is probably the one we all think of, was business. And unless that transatlantic line, the technology of the telegraph and Morse code all got developed by a few group of people, these businesses wouldn't have been able to suddenly start building on it. This is the beginning of international commodities. These are where those markets were born, because suddenly we can actually do business across the Atlantic. That's a technology made for one thing and used a different way historically. But that's still happening today. So GPS, driven entirely by the US government, and guess what? It was to protect them from missiles. All of the GPS investment is missile defense. That's what it was created for. It's actually some of the greatest technology and science innovation in history. You have to have an array of satellites. You have to do real-time math. And through all of this effort, you can now figure out where anything is in a very small space in real time on the planet Earth. That's pretty amazing. But it was mostly so that that little monitor could tell you if a missile was coming, right? That motivated them. But the second they made it an open platform, and I credit the US government for that, because it is an open platform that now every single person in this room has GPS. All of us use it. You probably used it today. Apparently you sat in traffic with it today. Great, but that changes the value of GPS. You look back at GPS and you value it very differently. And now, that's just where we are today with GPS. You look ahead, and we're trying to figure out its value when robots are using it. What happens when cars can drive themselves around? What happens when all of the Internet of Things can actually monitor itself and navigate the world? That's a whole set of value we haven't even yet figured out. That's the value of an original innovation changing, right? So what does that mean looking ahead? All right, Saneel, we'll get your history lesson. Let's just get to it. Cool. So if you look at these technology leaps, I mentioned we're in the convenience era. When we think of convenience, you think of like the light bulb or the washing machine or whatever you want to put on that list. But what's interesting, and I was thinking about this, is if you look at the companies doing convenience today, the ones dominating convenience, actually, it isn't the physical labor that they're saving us. Sure, you could argue that Amazon is, keeping you from having to go to the store because they bring something to you, but they didn't invent that. What's interesting, and you look at where Amazon is spending their money, it's actually to remove the cognitive load of shopping, like the mental labor of shopping. Alexa is a huge investment for them. Instead of having to remember, make a list of what to shop, remember to go and do it, you reach for a grocery, it's not there, and you just say, Alexa, please add Cheerios to the shopping list. Alexa now says, by the way, you may be running out of Cheerios out of nowhere. How did she know I was in the kitchen? How did she know that? This is them trying to reduce the mental effort of shopping. My point would be Google's doing the same thing. Google spent a lot of money organizing the world's information. Incredible, great resource, makes us all smarter. But if you look at Google's investments of late, they're trying to help you figure out even what to ask Google. Let me guide you into what you should do, what you should even be asking us for. Start typing in a search bar, it finishes it for you. That's a major leap for them because you can tell they're focused on the cognitive load. I won't bore you with the same examples. You can see how that applies to your social circles. You can see that applies to how you discover music. And interestingly, and I think I still very much put Instagram in this, but Instagram's a good example of it's visual design, right? Like everyone can take a photo, but the ability to make a photo of quality takes a lot of mental and cognitive load. It takes a lot of craft. It takes effort. And Instagram basically says, why don't we handle that for you? There's a couple options here. We can put it together, and suddenly everyone is a good photographer. And when I first started looking into this, I thought of TikTok that way. But as I learned more about it, I came to realize I think TikTok is doing something different, which is when I thought about the cognitive load it's helping with, it's about expression broadly. There wasn't any one thing you can put TikTok into. It's how you express yourself. And once I started to realize that, and I looked at all the emerging technologies, I came to realize I think we may be entering a fourth era of what's driving us. And I think we're finally up Maslow's hierarchy enough to be focused on expression as a driver. And that's an interesting place for society, but it also, if you put that in your head, completely reframes how you think about generative AI, how you think about AR, VR, how you think about Web3. If you see them as these are technologies to help humans express themselves, that becomes a pretty interesting lens of where we're going. And we can start to figure out how we're using it. So just a quick bit of evidence on it. The metaverse, obviously, you probably haven't heard about the metaverse in a year. Still being worked on. Not sure it was worth Facebook betting the farm on it. I'm sorry, Meta betting the farm on it. But who knows? But if you look at it, ultimately, if you believe the hierarchy, it's just about esteem. It's a virtualized opportunity for us to express ourselves in any different formats, in any different communities. That's an expression technology that isn't necessary otherwise, right? That's kind of interesting. That's a higher order need. Second, and this is what I thought was, I think, part of this bridge that allows things like TikTok to be created, is the cloud. Now, just because everyone always is like, oh, I know what the cloud is. I don't know what the cloud is. Is it like servers? Anything where you can borrow a computing bit of process, whether that's the actual processing power, security, storage. Just think of that via network. What's interesting is these companies that invested in this, they made it a service. So any of us right now can buy that for 1 minute. We could buy it for our life. We could borrow it for an hour. We could build a whole multi-billion-dollar business using someone else's cloud. The fact that they chose to make it a service is what enables, I think, this next generation of expression, this next era of expression. Because once it becomes a service, interesting things happen. Something like TikTok becomes to exist. TikTok is probably the greatest social algorithm ever written. It's full of AI for you. It handles a bunch of visual and really strong design effort for you. And the world's most powerful technologies come together, and then someone makes a video about dumplings and 100 million people watch it. That's expression in a nutshell. The amount of technology that it takes for her to just go and express herself about dumplings, her passion for dumplings, which I love, obviously, is interesting because it's only got one purpose, and it's expression. But it's only because these other steps that happen in terms of what tools we selected, making them available as a service, and then now we're figuring out how to apply it. The same is true. I put that little headshot thing in at the beginning because it's so bad. I've sped this up so you don't look at how horrible these photos are. These are all AI generated. I'm a complete amateur. I'm not a designer. I uploaded a couple headshots to an AI generated service, a Gen AI service. It generated new headshots for me. I dragged those into a morphing tool, and lo and behold, that thing gets made. That's all possible because there's APIs that allow this to happen. And then people build on top of those APIs and make free services for someone like me who isn't good at this, clearly. Then, when you start building on those things, this is what I think is interesting. This is just an example of a genuinely just silly ChatGPT game we made. But it had an interesting consequence for us. So we made this game. It's basically like a text-based game, like an old-school text-based game. But again, I don't know what it's going to say either because we don't control what the probability of the AI is. And it challenges CMOs to reinvent these businesses in these kind of funny scenarios, a bit like a Zork or an Oregon Trail or one of those games. What's interesting is people who had never used ChatGPT but could, once it was framed for them with a specific use, oh, I'm a CMO, I know you, and I know that, let me try this game. It dramatically expands the access to a core technology that wasn't built for them. Someone had to step in and expand that access by making it useful for them, right? And that is where I think this stuff gets super interesting because it's access that changes, like we talked about, the value of the original innovation. What we're allowing more people to do with stuff goes backwards and makes it more valuable. And that's a pretty important point, especially if you're in this room, because of what you do for a living. Because let me just show you what an interesting moment of time we're in. It took the World Wide Web 7 years to get to 100 million users. It took Facebook 4.5. I was blown away when TikTok did it in under a year. And now ChatGPT, because of this, got there in 2 months. 100 million users doing something in 2 months. It's a staggering number to get your head around. But clearly, that means that there is a shift in what we think the value of this is. Even if we don't know where it's going, all of us can play a role by participating in that access. So if access is going to be this the driving force where we can impact it, what's our role, right? And I always think of this quote about, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, Clarke's third law, about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's pretty powerful. The problem with magic is it's easy to sit it out and go, well, I don't know anything about magic. I'm not one of the people who makes the stuff, so I'll just see what the magic does. And then there are the people who go, I would love to have a superpower like magic, and let me dive in. And my argument to you would be, if you're a marketer today, you actually have the ability to start making some of this magic. And that is because, as we talked about, these are those companies that, unless you work at one of these companies, you are probably not directly moving forward the core technology of AI. But here's what's interesting. These are very powerful companies, but they do actually, you might not be in this room, but you're right outside this room. And the reason you're right outside this room is because there's going to be $1 trillion in advertising spent globally, again, US dollars, globally, on advertising. Of those, these are the companies receiving it. So what do you think a huge lever for these companies are? So normally this stuff is happening inside a government. It's happening in these places. Unless you can get a meeting with Elon, you're probably not participating. But if you work in this business, you actually have a lever to change what tools are being created. You can actually go back up that cycle, not just how you're using it, but what tools we think they should make. And I think you can play a key role there as a marketer. And I find that incredibly powerful because it's probably about as close as the Hamilton rap goes as you can be inside the room. So, 4 lessons, my recommendations to you all on what you could do as marketers to influence this stuff. Again, looking back at history, but using that to look ahead a little bit. The first one is technology can reinforce inequalities. It's easy to go, yeah, I'm sure that's true. This repeats itself in almost every example across all those dots. Every time you look at the first couple generations of what we're doing with that technology, it actually negatively reinforces existing inequalities. And it takes effort to figure out how to do something about it. Those vaccines I was excited about, that girl I showed you getting the smallpox vaccine, she did that 150 years after the vaccine was actually invented. And the reason is because when vaccines first came out, they were for the government officials and aristocrats. And so unless you were connected to the government or had incredible wealth, actually you were probably still going to get smallpox and die. Your life is clearly not worth any less, but you don't have the access to do it. So actually the vaccines allowed people to be protected and wander about. That's inequality that being doubled down on. It wasn't until the WHO stepped in, the World Health Organization, fundraised, got countries to work together, and started rolling out what's actually pretty cheap to distribute to many people, work on those key technologies. This is true of healthcare today. We have a digital divide in healthcare. I shouldn't even talk about healthcare because I come from the US, one of the worst healthcare systems on the planet. It is the most unequal system in the world. I'm lucky I'm on the right side of it, but I'm only because of luck, no other reason. That said, even in socialized medicine countries, the digital divide of healthcare still exists, which is to say everyone has equal right to healthcare, but you know what? If you can do telemedicine, if you can carry your own data, if you can book your doctor's appointments and have them contact each other differently through digital devices and services, you're going to get better healthcare. It doesn't matter. By definition, your digital experiences are going to impact that for you. And we have to be able to look at, if we're building these things, are we only doubling down on the inequality that exists there? Because it's clearly a problem today. Healthcare inequality is a huge deal, and technology plays a big role in it. So how does that apply looking ahead? I pulled some stats on Web3, and they're kind of nuts, because the inequality is already there. First of all, 2/3 of people working in Web3 are highly educated. Highly educated doesn't mean they just graduated high school, right? They have advanced degrees. Generally speaking, and this is just a general correlation, that means those people are rich, okay? So you currently have highly educated, rich people building a thing, telling everyone it's for them too, and lo and behold, of course you end up with a lot of headlines about scams, because you have people who understand something with more privilege selling things or working with people that don't understand it necessarily. That's not the technology being bad, that's because an inequality existed and the technology just doubled down on it. And the reason it doubled down on it, and I'm not blaming men in general, but this is about the most biased number you could find, only 5% of Web3 companies are founded by females. 5%. How can something where 95% of the companies doing it are fully founded by men possibly not have bias in it? By definition, it will be biased, right? And so there is a little bit of hope, and it sounds small, but I want to point it out. This is an NFT collection called Deadfellows. Does anyone in this room own an NFT? Are you too embarrassed to admit it in front of your friends? I see a couple of you kind of looking at me like, let's talk afterwards. Cool. So generally speaking, NFTs are like a hits business. They're either really popular or no one participated at all. This is a hit. And what's interesting about this hit, and I just want to point it out, is it's 9,999 zombies. Sounds trivial, but it was the first major hit that had no gender bias in it in the way the art was represented. Because generally, if you're a man making NFTs, you tend to make men. And really, it's amazing. If you go through NFT collections, they are very masculine. And this actually had male, female, gender nonconforming, and amazingly, it represented humanity best while being an NFT about zombies. And I found that to just be both charming and interesting, and a little bit of creativity, a superpower that Teresa pointed out, helping reflect the right world back to us, even if they're zombies. So my one advice or recommendation or lesson I take as a fellow marketer is we actually have an opportunity to reflect and amplify what's happening appropriately and help fix some of the hard-coded inequalities that are already built into these new technologies. But we have to take that as our responsibility if we're going to have a creative superpower that impacts something. Let's not double down on that inequality. The second thing, and I get asked this question probably second most, which is, does an innovation lead to job change? And the answer is yes. All the data says yes, but that job change almost always ends up differently than people expect. I know there's at least one bank in the room from a previous conversation. But when ATMs came out, right, automated cash machines, everyone said, well, bank tellers are dead. That'll never happen again. By the way, the person whose job was to just count out the cash that you needed out of your account, that job is dead. It got replaced by a machine. Those companies that had ATM machines ended up being able to bring down the cost of a branch and a location of a bank, and ended up opening more banks and ended up employing more people working at banks in the same neighborhoods from that advancement. That's not the same thing. Someone still lost their job, but more people got jobs out of it. And those people, even if some of them had a role in counting money, now could do other things. That's a tough balance to get. And I'm not saying it works every time, but this is one of those historical examples we could learn from. And someone who could learn from it, as you probably guessed, is Hollywood. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Hollywood actors and Hollywood writers are all striking, and the main issue, the second main issue, depending on who you talk to, is AI. That's a sticky one, because of course, if you're a studio, you think, could I do this without all the annoying actors? Or just use their likeness, or just have, instead of dealing with these writers, maybe just generate all that. Obviously, that would destroy their own business. There's probably a balance to figure out how those tools could help both parties, because we've done it many times before. I think it actually helps to have unions in that conversation. I think what gets difficult is to have an opinion on a technology. That's where you start making the pie smaller instead of bigger. What is the right role of technology that both sides can benefit from? And I have some optimism about it. I thought this was interesting. 27% of marketers are actually worried about AI threatening their job security, which I was surprised by. The numbers seem pretty high to me. You know, I love this quote from Scott Galloway, because he has the same view I do. I don't know if you know who Scott Galloway is. He's an NYU professor, a very kind of big thinker. I have a lot of respect for him. And he had this quote, which I love, which is, you shouldn't be scared of losing your job to AI. You should be scared of losing your job to someone who understands AI. And this is the point. The tool didn't do something to you. The tool is available. How do you make yourself better or broader, or potentially do more with what you already have using that tool? And I think that's the question that lays in front of everybody. Back to the Hollywood point, I would love it if both sides asked themselves that question and then had started the discussion from there, because I can't imagine the list is mutually exclusive. But interestingly, while people are scared of AI, these marketers, 1 in 4, almost 2/3 claim to use AI every day. I saw this number, and I was actually blown away, because there's no way that is right. In fact, that number, I think, might be 100. You just might not understand what it is that you're using AI for because of how we talk about AI. Many agency people here, many clients here, inevitably you are writers or designers, or you have writers or designers. And guess what? They're using tools like Grammarly. We don't replace our writers with Grammarly. We pay for a subscription so that all of them can use Grammarly. It makes them better writers. It helps them with clarity of thought. It makes sure they don't get redundant. It's a creative spark for them, but it's also an efficiency engine. You know what? Let me just, in the same way you don't even learn to type the right words anymore, it kills me my 11-year-old can't spell anything, because guess what? It's being auto-corrected for all the time. I look at that and I go, is that an actual problem, or is that just a problem for my generation? And I'm not sure what the answer is. And I think the same is how we think about tools like this. I'm assuming everyone in here works directly with themselves or works with someone who uses Photoshop. Guess what? You've been using AI for almost 10 years. That's how the magic tools work. That is machine learning, predicting what that next pixel is going to be and how you can do large swaths of design quickly. We got better at our jobs from the tool. It is possible when we start focusing on the job replacement bit of it, because we think all of my value is this thing. That's when we get into the wrong conversation. So my advice here would be for all of us to actually think about creativity as a system. How do we design a system and go, what are the roles of the tools in that system, and what are our roles with it? And yes, the job mix may change, but generally speaking, I think you have the opportunity for people to do more with what they have and probably grow your business if you think about it this way. And creativity is hard. It's never, in my opinion, it is the last business that can be replaced by anything. There's a real opportunity to get more creative with these tools. The third one, there's 4 of these for perspective, and then I will wrap, is that technology runs on the back of people. This is a clear observation when you do this history lesson in innovation, and it's sad, and I'm sorry I've told you some depressing stories, but there's a bar that can fix it for you afterwards. The American rail system, which is a huge innovation at the time, is basically built by slaves and by convicts, the very people that couldn't actually ride this new innovation. There's a human cost in that. It can feel invisible when you're writing it because you didn't have to deal with that process, but it exists because you're not directly tied to it. You would think that's a problem of the past. Guess who's developing most rail in the world right now? It's in Africa. Most of the people developing that rail can't ride the rail they're working on. This many years later, we are still doing the exact same thing because we have not acknowledged there's a human cost to technology. But if you start to acknowledge it, you can start to rethink what you're doing with it. And I want to point that out about AI, because this, in my opinion, because the rail's an easy example for me, because I can show you, look at these photos of people who built this, and then look at the people who ride on it. See how they're different? Most people think of AI as this kind of humanless thing. But it turns out, actually, AI needs a lot of humans. And ask your developer friends or ask anyone who works in the space, there are a lot of humans involved in AI. Because someone has to train the machines, right? And I'm going to give you a couple simple examples that we don't see. Again, no, I'm not going to promise it's the last depressing story. I may have more. Which is the cost of how we actually make sure that our content is filtered. So generally in the Southern Hemisphere, even though you're not encountering horrible beheading videos, live shooters, violence, things like that, yes, the machines are learning on what to filter out, but this isn't a one-time process. Humans have to sit through and watch this stuff. These are large farms of people. They have a high suicide rate. They're not paid nearly enough. They have almost no benefit. They're very low-paid workers helping YouTube, who I'm not picking on in particular, eliminate horrible content that keeps you safe because that's super convenient, because that's where brand safety comes from. It's also just things that you don't want to encounter. There's a human cost. There's always a human cost to it if you go back far enough. Here's an interesting one that sits right here. See, the other ones feel like that's someone else. Actually, this is us right here, right? So we know this because we do it for a living. You guys remember when Mark Zuckerberg did his congressional interview during, if you don't know this, when the US was going to crack down after I think it was directly after the Trump election, and we got into the fake news arguments, Mark Zuckerberg was asked by a congressman, how is it free? Because the business doesn't make sense to him. How can it be free? And you kind of see he pauses because he's also struggling to process that this question is being asked to him. And he goes, Senator, we sell ads. Yeah, of course. That you're not, and the reason that you sell ads is because it is targeted by data. What we do for a living, you communicate with people, you need to target them, you need to give them the right message at the right time, we buy advertising, we buy data, we make messages, all of that is fueled by data, and this is a lesson that not everyone knows. We might know it because we do it for a living, but the reality is, and I love this quote, it still applies. This is from the 1970s. If a product is free, you're not the customer, you're the product. Your data is the thing, right? If you're a user of any of these platforms. Well, there's a lot of technologies that can fix this problem for us, but guess what? They also would need to be ad supported, because blockchain allows you to keep, the promise of Web3 is decentralization. Instead of having a few companies that build up just these data reserves that are huge, it blocks other people out. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm telling you that is just the definition of what I mean about a limited group decides our major technology leaps because they have the resources. And data was one of those. If in a Web3 world, everyone owns their own data and you can travel with it. And all industries go through this. Financial services is starting to go through it. Telecom already went through it. And now we're starting to understand what would the impact be for the media business as a whole if people own their own data. Shouldn't they be rewarded for that in some way? This is a company called Stacks. It basically is like an app ecosystem where anyone can build anything on top of it, but the users own their data, because that's how blockchain works, right? They can't control that. There's nothing they can manipulate to change that. So my argument would be, if you do this for a living and you fund companies that rely on users for value, you know what? Like I said, you're right outside the door. The lever that matters for these companies is ad dollars, marketing dollars. I think we have an opportunity to actually shift some of those behaviors. I'm not saying don't spend money with big players. Of course, spend money with big players. But maybe there's some of these other players with new models that we can start to experiment with, because I think there's something really positive in that, where we do have some power here. And I'll close by pointing out a fairly obvious one, but one that this is probably the most repeated and scariest one of the group, but also I think the best opportunity of the group, which is historically, technology blurs reality and fantasy. It always has. The definitions change. When the various multiple country postal systems were all being developed around the same time, and we're trying to find a way to make sure that we could send mail to each other across countries. And in the mail, many people opened something and it said, because the difference in pricing and stamps in that other country to this country, you can invest and you can make money on your stamps, because actually to send 20 grams costs different in these neighboring countries, and you can arbitrage and make money on that. And that sounded like a great idea. So people invested. Here's the best part about this investment. If you get other people to invest, you can make even more money. And so more and more people started doing it. It came through the mail. It was about mail, right? The person at the top of that pyramid, Charles Ponzi, where we get the phrase, the Ponzi scheme. That is the definition of using a new technology. It's funny to think about now, but the Postal Service, confusing what reality looks like because you think you're investing in this thing that seems like it's growing, and I think I'm participating a little bit like NFTs today that have been a problem. If you don't know enough or no one's helping educate you, you can be fooled into confusing the reality and the fantasy. Has anyone seen this? This is a conversation between the mayor of Berlin and the mayor of Kiev. Anyone see this? This is an interesting conversation. It lasted about 15 minutes before the mayor of Berlin started going, something seems off, because everything I understand about the mayor of Kiev's policies, these strategies seem different. There's some pretty radical things being said that I don't think he would agree with. Something seems off. It turns out, and this is a real life, live conversation happening over Zoom, that's because that's a deep fake. That's not him. If there's enough content about you on the internet, then actually it's pretty easy to deepfake you. It's why government officials and celebrities get this stuff all the time. She is a person who does this for a living. I'm not picking on her. This happened to many mayors. I think this could happen to most people. But if you don't have the fluency in the reality to know when it's fantasy, it can absolutely be used against you, right? And that's what happened here. It's funny to look back at the Postal Service scam that Ponzi said, but this feels like something probably maybe a lot of us could fall for, right? And maybe you'll figure it out eventually, but that's a pretty difficult first 15 minutes to broadcast to your people, and it's alarming. Deepfakes are a real thing. Technology does that. So what are we doing to address it? In the US, we took the US approach. Here's a voluntary set of things we'd love for you to do. Could you please sign up really, really rich companies? And the EU, they took the most EU approach, which is, we're going to strictly lay out every detail of what you're allowed to do, or you will not do business here. And honestly, I think the answer is probably a little bit of both of these. I don't think there's a right answer in how we decide where reality and fantasy come together, but I wanted to show you an example of something. This is an image from Midjourney. Midjourney is like a common, it's a generative AI tool, right? You make images there. You probably, if you work in this business, probably somewhere in a designer that was up really late was like, you know what, I'm just going to get someone else to turn this out and I'll edit it. It's a starting point for designers often. This is one of the most popular images from it. This image, if it was put next to the wrong headline, you could see how my dad, who would never be able to identify that, my sister would never know that's AI generated. I do this enough that I can recognize the genre, but at some point even I won't be able to do that, and those of us, of course, we can't all be right all the time. There's no scenario where you're going to get a collection of Native Americans together smiling at a camera. There isn't. But if you write something next to it, that changes your perception of what you're reading about, how they feel about something or what's happening to them, because that image exists and it looks real to you. You can see how we're no longer in these one-on-one deep fake things. You're starting to potentially completely misunderstand the context of what you're reading about. That's fantasy blurring reality. And so in that voluntary bill that the US put out, one of the things was all AI images should be watermarked. Watermarked is, instead of having to guess if that was an AI-generated image, it would have a watermark on it, and everyone would know. This is what I mean about balance. Google said, that's a great idea. We'll make sure that AI images are marked. I love it. This fake moon landing image is a famous one that also got shared in fake news. But look at how you have to go about it. That's not a watermark. That's like, hey, maybe we'll make sure it's somewhere in there. That's the tough part about finding this balance. How do we figure out where fantasy ends and reality starts? But we're going to have to find a way to agree as a system, because if everyone just makes up their own, and I give Google credit for this, by the way, but I don't think it's far enough, then how does a regular person who, remember, the less educated you are, the less familiar you are with something, the more likely you are to be scammed. But a bit of closing inspiration here. I don't know if you all saw this. I think it won in Cannes or something. Yeah, Demetrius keeps track of every award. I like that. This is a campaign. It is a deep fake. That's David Beckham, for those of you who don't know. And it was raising money for malaria. yes, we have the stature of David Beckham, someone a lot of people look up to and listen to. And yet, without him having to leave his apartment, he could speak to you in your local language. He could speak to you about your local places, like naming things around you, showing you the impact of malaria. And it felt very regionalized, very much this is him talking to me. That's fantasy because, again, he doesn't speak those languages. He doesn't know those places necessarily. But it was a very compelling pitch for people, and they did raise money for it. That's fantasy, but I think it's using fantasy for good. Which is why my last argument here for us would be, can we find some practices we agree on? If we're going to point at companies that say, hey, Google, that's a great step, but I need you to take it a step further. And by the way, I need all these other companies to sign up too. That's easy to say when we don't do it. This is our job. What is our role around fantasy with reality as people who have this technology available to us? And again, we spend money with the companies that are deciding the core technologies today. So I think we can have a huge positive influence here if we want to. So, closing, this is very quick. Ultimately, hopefully, you understood. I don't necessarily have an opinion that technology is good or bad. I don't think that's the right question. But the one thing I feel confident about is that it is made by us and shaped by us, and we use it. So let's all feel responsibility because we're actually the ones right outside the door this is happening. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.